Welcome to the Emperor's Dragon Part 1, Nestling, Chapters 46 and 47. Let's begin. Izuku poked at the tablet despondently. He really didn't know what to do with it. He knew Dr. Garaki was running several experiments, but right at the moment he wasn't interested in them. He was only interested in things that would heal his dad. He tapped his way through Dr. Garaki's files without any real purpose. Eventually, Izuku put the tablet down and just sat with his back against the tube. He listened to the liquid in it bubbling and watched as Gigantomachia paced around the room. He let himself feel his dad again. His quirks were still there, glowing like a beacon above Izuku's head. It was a comfort, in and of itself. All the little colored lights gathered around his dad. He let his eyes unfocus and just watched them with his quirk for a while. His dad had so many. He felt proud of that. It meant he'd helped so many people. Under all of them, Izuku knew his dad's quirk was there and he focused, trying to get a glimpse of it. Except when he did that, he saw other quirks. The little points of light weren't in the room. They weren't the doctor or Gigantomachia, they were outside. Not that far. Izuku used the distance to the doctor to estimate the distance these quirks were. They were probably in the next room, or maybe a little further. Some of them were really close together, as if the person had multiple quirks. "There are others here?" he asked softly. The question came as a bit of a surprise given the way it startled the doctor. With his eyes unfocused, Izuku didn't see the details of the look the doctor gave him. "There are," the old man eventually answered. "But you don't need to worry about them." "Okay," Izuku replied, somewhat dreamily. He was still focusing on the quirks around them. He stretched out further and this time felt quirks moving around. There were only a few of them and they didn't seem to be coming closer. Izuku concluded they were people outside the building. He felt thankful that there weren't that many. It was safer. He brought his attention back to those who were closer. There really were several which had to be in the same person. Excepting his dad, and Gigantomachia, Izuku had never seen anyone with two quirks before. "Why do the close people have more than one quirk?" he asked. "Those are my experiments," the doctor told him. "They aren't something you need to worry about, Izuku." "Why do they have quirks?" Izuku asked. The doctor chuckled. "Izuku, I perform research into quirks, so of course. My experiments have quirks." The boy nodded and didn't notice when the doctor heaved a sigh of relief that there were no follow-up questions. Izuku sat for several more moments before he lifted the tablet. He released his hold on his quirk and looked at the screen. He flicked back and forth, going into the doctor's server. There were lots of folders there. Izuku had seen some of it before, during his summers, and he just wasn't sure what he should look at. He knew it was the doctor's way of distracting him, but all he could think about was how to get a look at a quirk registry. He had no idea how to do it without Nasuto. And yes, he felt bad that Nasuto had died, but he hadn't really known the man that well. He was more concerned about his dad. Though, Izuku frowned as a thought occurred. He knew the doctor did research into quirks, but he'd never really thought how. It made sense that he worked with quirks if he was researching them, but maybe he had a link to a registry. He looked at the tablet and typed "registry" into the search. He was somewhat surprised when there were several results. A couple were registry papers, but there was a folder in the results. Izuku clicked to it. There was a list of subfolders. His eyes widened when he recognized a list of countries. The doctor didn't have a list of the registries, did he? Izuku decided he didn't care. He scrolled down the list and went into the folder named Japan. In there were a couple of documents. He looked at the sizes and clicked to open the biggest. Izuku didn't recognize the program, but he could see the list of information. It really was a list of quirks. And he could see the name of the person with the quirk next to it, and more importantly, their location. There was also a description of the quirk, but as Izuku scrolled down, he realized it wasn't always filled in. Even so, a smile spread across his face and Izuku brought up a search and typed "regeneration" in the quirk name search field. The smile vanished when there were no results. But then he thought about his own quirks, and those of his friends. The names weren't always the best descriptor, but with more of the descriptions blank than filled out, he had no choice. He bit the inside of his lip as he tried to think of what other words might be used to name a regeneration quirk. Self-healing was the obvious choice and he entered that. Again, no results came up. Maybe they didn't want to use the word healing. Cure brought up nothing. It wasn't that there were no quirks, it was that the results weren't what he was looking for. Or there was a mark against the quirk to indicate that the government checked on it. They were healing quirks but not the type he could get. He needed something that wouldn't attract any hero's attention. What other words could be used for regeneration? He knew from his own quirks that sometimes the name wasn't that descriptive. Fire breath was, but Kali Imperium wasn't. And that brought in other languages. He'd just have to be patient. Izuku ran a Goduk search. Bethany, Bishop's Wart, Hedgenettle, and Prunella vulgaris all came up blank. He didn't even know what they were, and he didn't think people would actually call their quirk that. Renew, Revive, and Rehabilitate also came up blank. Fix It seemed too childish, but Izuku entered it when he thought of the combination. It sounded more like a healing quirk than a self-healing quirk, and when a result came up, he wasn't too surprised when there was a mark beside the person's name, indicating that they were a professional doctor for the government. Izuku stopped searching for a while as he thought. Regeneration is what he wanted, but specifically regeneration of the body. He knew it was possible because Setsuna could do it. If someone took a bit of her body, she could regrow it. She'd done it often enough with fingers. Wait. Regrow. He typed that in. Izuku almost shouted when there were results. More than one. There was a little hitch in his breath when he saw that. He looked at the quirk names and wondered which was which. Well, it wasn't regrow plants. That one actually had a description. Reviving and regrowing organic plant material wasn't what he wanted. That left two others. Neither had a description. Regrowth, belonging to a woman, Jiko Chiyu, in Kyoto, and regrown, belonging to a man, Yilusan Logan in Hirosaki. He couldn't tell which would be better, but Kyoto was closer. Izuku sent the details of both quirks to his phone and then clicked out of the quirk registry before putting the tablet down. If it wasn't one of these two quirks, he'd have to search again, but now he had a new problem: how to get to Kyoto. Kurogiri was the obvious answer, but he just didn't want the man knowing. Not yet. There was something holding him back. The man was already doing all he could, bringing in healers. And Dr. Garaki and Kurogiri knew what his quirk was. Why hadn't they asked about this possibility? The train went to Kyoto, and while he didn't have enough money, Tomura had the card. Money wasn't going to be an issue here. Finding this Jiko Chiyu might be the real problem, but Izuku tilted his head back. Looking up at the bubbling tank of liquid his father was floating in. There was all the reason he'd need. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Sir Nighteye said as he entered the office. "It's the least I could do, given the situation," the Hero Public Safety Commissioner said. Suken Haruta was an older man. He was a career public servant. He knew exactly what to say and what not to say as the situation demanded, but he also knew when he had to see heroes and sidekicks personally, and when they could be fobbed off to his underlings. Mirai was assured that as All Might's sidekick, he was on the personal list. "How is Toshinori doing?" Suken asked as Mirai took a seat. "Is between surgeries at the moment," All Might's sidekick answered. "And the doctors are keeping him unconscious. It would be useful to speak to Yagi at the moment, but medically it would probably cause more problems." Heroes had a lot of sway in the community, but in a hospital, the doctors ruled. Commissioner Haruta nodded. "Probably for the best," he murmured. While a patient's records were confidential, he would have seen at least the initial report on the damage done. Even so, Mirai knew what the real question was, except, he didn't know the answer. With damage as severe as had been inflicted on Toshinori, would he have to retire as a hero? Only time would tell, but he wasn't going to be doing things for at least a month. Probably longer if he actually obeyed the doctors. "So, as much as I appreciate the update, what did you want to see me about?" Suken asked. His eyes were sharp. "The villain," Mirai stated. "Toxic Chainsaw will not be in a position to contradict anything we say," Suken told him. Mirai nodded. That wasn't his concern, but it was good to have it confirmed. "The press release will be forwarded to the Commission for approval within the hour," he told the Commissioner. It better be he'd approved the final draft earlier, and it was going through marketing at the moment. "I'm more concerned about those who saw the villain," he elaborated. "They've already been spoken to. As have Eraserhead and Scarab. They won't be contradicting anything. That was expected. The rescue group would know that sometimes the truth caused more harm than good, and he fully expected the underground heroes to go along with the HPSC's story. I was more concerned about his body, Mirai told the commissioner. His body? Sukin asked. It was not in the morgue, Sir Nighteye explained. The commissioner nodded his understanding. Mirai's eyes narrowed slightly, but he forced himself to relax. You were going to identify his civilian identity? Sukin asked for confirmation. I was. It has been decided that it's best if Hisashi Rigi simply disappears, the commissioner told him blandly. Sir Nighteye blinked and then reinterpreted the sentence in political speak. The government was going to blame something on JBQC and specifically All for One's civilian persona, but what? So Hisashi will have been taken directly to Tartarus? He probed. It still didn't explain where All for One's body was. Sukin smiled. Yes. That was an acceptable cover story. Those in Tartarus did not get visitors. And has he been taken to Tartarus? Mirai asked. He was adept at political speak, but there was no room for error here. The commissioner didn't reply immediately, and Sir Nighteye began to worry. They could maintain the fiction that Hisashi Rigi had committed some crime and had been incarcerated in Tartarus all they wanted, so long as his body was actually there. Such an interesting ability, Sukin said finally. To take and give quirks, he elaborated. There exists quirks to temporarily copy quirks, to shut them down and to do all sorts of wondrous things. But to take them permanently? I did not believe it possible until I read the file. Sir Nighteye hadn't believed it was possible either until he started working with Toshinori. And All Might's quirk. So fantastic. A legacy of the beginning. Just the same as Hisashi. It is something that must be studied. The commissioner smiled at him. For a moment Sir Nighteye felt disgusted, but then he nodded as he translated the words. The commissioner couldn't just tell him that outright, not when it involved human research. That was strictly monitored and usually forbidden. Especially quirk research, even on corpses. All for One's body was not at Tartarus. With him being dead, there was no need for that, though the public story would be that he was there. His body was instead at some research lab. What of his wife and son? Mirai asked. Tartarus may not have visitation rights, but as far as he knew, Hisashi Rigi had never divorced Inko Midoriya, so she could have a claim on his assets, as would his son. Hisashi Rigi was, publicly, a very wealthy man, and probably owned many of his assets legitimately, and the sidekick had seen the way people came out of the woodwork when money was involved. His what? Sukin demanded, his eyes going wide. Hisashi's wife and son, Sir Nighteye repeated blandly. Did the commissioner not know how All for One had been tracked down? Had he been so blinded by the potential research? I do not believe he is divorced from his wife, but definitely separated, as he took their son and left about 5 years ago. He didn't have to elaborate further. Sukin understood what that meant. Even if the wife didn't have a claim on assets, the son did. That complicated matters. The government could claim assets from Hisashi Rigi's estate if there was no one to claim the estate. No one would look into it too closely, however, even if the wife did not wish to claim anything, the law recognized the son's claim. It was far better than the government's. Where is the boy? The commissioner asked. There was a gleam in his eye that made Mirai thankful he had the answer he did. He didn't care for the child the way Tsukauchi seemed to, but he knew what that gleam meant. The commission were. They were human, with all the vices and problems that entailed. I don't know. Sir Nighteye replied. The police inform me that he hasn't attended school since the battle. Sukin knew what that meant. Either the child, Izuku, was with Hisashi's trusted lieutenants and would be raised to take his father's position, or those self-same lieutenants had seen the opportunity for personal advancement. If Izuku had Hisashi's quirk, All for One, or a copy of it, the commission was not getting a live test subject. At length, the commissioner nodded. Thank you for letting me know. I'll see to it that the appropriate arrangements are made, he announced. Mirai nodded. The statement was a catch-all, but probably translated to the wife would get some benefits, so she had no reason to claim more, and something would be put aside for the son, though if he appeared, the commission would re-examine their options, and Mirai knew that the preferred option would be to take him as a test subject. No, thank you for allaying my concerns about Hisashi, Mirai returned as he rose. He wasn't happy that All for One's body would be experimented on, but it was better than the alternative of him, somehow, impossibly, surviving. Of course, Sukin told him, smiling as Mirai left his office. Once outside, Sir Nighteye shook his head slightly. He wondered if there'd come a day when the Commission was the enemy, and all he could conclude was that was possibly. Except, it wasn't today, and for now, that was enough. Izuku pressed himself against a wall as he looked around. Kyoto Station was huge and there were people everywhere. Tomura was beside him and they were both looking for instructions on how to get to Platform 4. Once Gigantamakia had let him leave, and Kurogiri had taken him home, Izuku had told Tomura that he'd potentially found a regeneration quirk. The fact that it was in Kyoto didn't bother the older boy. He'd wanted to leave then, but Izuku had pointed out that it was evening. There were fewer trains. Plus he needed to find out where this Jiko Chiyu lived. Tomura had immediately gone to look into travel plans, while Izuku searched for more information about the woman. Thankfully, he found that she still lived in Kyoto, and Tomura discovered that Kyoto was about 2 hours away by train. They could be there and back in a day. Then they'd both done more research into Jiko Chiyu. Tomura had found her lifebook, which had given them some information. She worked at home, or at least appeared to, so that's where they were going to go. Izuku was somewhat thankful for that. He remembered going through security with his dad when he was suspended, and knew that if she worked in an office building, they'd have been stuck on the outside. Now, if only they could find Platform 4, which would get them on one of the local trains to take them towards Jiko Chiyu's house. After the local train, they had to get on a bus. And then they had to walk to find the right street and house. But if they could do it fast enough, they'd be able to be back on the train by mid-afternoon. They shouldn't get into too much trouble. But they had to find Platform 4. And then get on the right train. Are you lost? The question caught him by surprise and Izuku looked to the left. There was a girl about his age standing there. She had pink hair which stuck up around her head. A pair of goggles were over her eyes and they appeared to have some attachments. Despite not seeing her eyes, Izuku could tell she was looking at them intently. She had a backpack on with a variety of stick-like things poking out of it. No, we're not, Tomura replied as Izuku nodded. She looked at them oddly. Yeah, you're lost. I can tell. Out-of-towners, she announced. Which means you need one of these. The girl pulled her backpack around and pulled something out of it. Izuku looked at it. The object was round with a little screen on one side and what looked to be antennas. He didn't know. It's a finder. You just tell it where you want to go and it will direct you. We don't need a GPS. Tomura growled. It's not a GPS, it's a finder. The girl objected. GPS just scream at you, this actually finds stuff. Can it find people? Izuku asked. She grinned at him, while still holding out the device. Of course. If you've got a picture, it will find them. Give me a photo and let me show you. There was a certain exuberance to her demand and Izuku found himself holding up his phone, which had a photo of Jiko Chiyu that Tomura had found on Lifebook. She grinned and held her device out, letting it look at the photo and then it leapt from her hands, floating up above the people's heads. It zipped around for a little, darting back and forth and Izuku could see on the screen it was scanning the faces of the people around them. It really was a finder. And then the alarms went off. Both Izuku and Tomura startled at the noise. The girl just rolled her eyes. Or at least she seemed to. Izuku couldn't tell with the goggles that were still covering her eyes. Get that drone down, Hatsume. The call came over the public address system. That just caused her to huff. It's not a drone. It's a finder. She growled, loud enough to be heard by them but obviously not by the person who was watching. But she did make a gesture towards her gizmo and it came back and hovered over their heads. This baby will work, where there's not overly strict watchers, she told them. We don't need it. Tomura growled and Izuku felt him grab his shoulder. He had gloves on so there was no danger from his quirk. Hatsume. Came another warning over the PA. Then you're going to remain lost, she told them, ignoring the PA. And you can have my finder, all for 500 yen. Hatsume. The speaker over the PA was becoming very tired. Izuku reached up, and with a push from Kaylee Imperium he caught the round device. Was that your quirk? The girl immediately asked, pushing up her googles. Her eyes were yellow. He couldn't help but notice that given the way she was bent forward, and her face tilted so that it was right against his. Except with the gesture there was no threat. She had no pupils though, just a series of marks that looked like a targeting crosshairs. No, Izuku managed the lie but he knew it wasn't good enough. I'll take it, he added to give some distraction. You will? The question came from both the girl Hatsum and Tomura. Izuku nodded. It will be useful where there are less people. He explained. That, and he wanted the PA to stop. 500 yen, right? At that, Hatsum drew back. There was an odd look on her face, and for a moment, Izuku thought she'd change her mind. Then she grinned. Yep. 500 yen. She held out another device. Thankfully, this one's use was obvious. Izuku reached around himself, balancing the finder in one arm as he pulled out his phone. He tapped his phone to the scanner and it beeped. Then it displayed 500 yen. His phone beeped as well. Izuku looked down, expecting to see the app confirm the sale, but he saw that he'd actually got contact details as well. You're my first customer, Hatsum said, a little softly. There was something sweet about the statement, and Izuku smiled. There she is. The shout came from the distance. Hatsum's face changed immediately. It lost any softness and she jerked up and looked around. Izuku couldn't see what she saw, but she grinned. Gotta go. She practically yelled and then took off into the crowd. Wait. Where's platform 4? Izuku shouted at her, very quickly retreating back. That way. Hatsum pointed without slowing. The green-eyed boy looked in the direction she pointed, and sure enough he could see a sign that said, Platform 4. There was a sub-note on it that announced the train line they needed was there too. Izuku looked back at Tomura as he clutched the device and his phone, and he sort of wondered what happened. Still, they now knew where Platform 4 was, so that was a good thing. Security guards rushed up to them before Izuku could think of anything else. We're fine, Tomura huffed, before he pointed. She went that way, he added. The guards looked him over, and Izuku could tell they were being assessed before the guards, one man, one woman, rushed off after Hatsum, who was, now, nowhere to be seen. Let's go, Tomura growled, grabbing Izuku's shoulder. He managed to slip his phone back in his pocket and grab a hold of the device as Tomura dragged him towards Platform 4. Now they just had to find Jiko Chiyu, and then they could help his dad. Izuku smiled softly. This was going to be a good day. Tomura's phone beeped as they came up on the street Jiko Chiyu was meant to live on. It was a pretty quiet neighborhood. The houses were all cream-colored, and all seemed to have a small balcony on the second story. The front of the houses had space for a car, but they'd walked past a lot of bikes stowed in those areas. They turned down the street, and Izuku knew that anyone watching them would have thought that they were kids who lived here. This is it, Tomura announced. Izuku looked up at the house. It had a cream facade and black gutters. There was a small white K car in the space with an extendable fence closed in front of it. The front garden area actually had a cover, and a push bike was parked out the front of the house. The house next door was a darker color and had a satellite dish on it. Izuku noticed for no reason except that he was nervous. Can you sense her? Tomura demanded. I can sense someone, Izuku replied. This was the first time he was going to take a quirk from someone he didn't know. He'd taken quirks from his dad and Tomura, but he knew them, and they knew they would get them back. Jiko Chiyu didn't know what was going on. Would she be scared? Would she? He didn't know what to think. Izuku swallowed before his nerves could make him nauseous. Well, grab the quirk and we can test it. The teen demanded. We should tell her, Izuku objected. For a moment, it looked like Tomura was going to fight him on that. Then the teen's eyes changed slightly. I'll tell her, he said. But check the quirk first, he instructed. That made sense and actually gave Izuku a bit of relief. He nodded, before closing his eyes and reaching out. He could feel Tomura's gray decay next to him, but in the house before them, there was another quirk. It was a brilliant, almost pulsing red. Izuku reached out and grabbed it. Do you have it? Tomura asked when his eyes opened again. Izuku nodded. The quirk felt kind of odd. Like it was stretching out, over his body. The teen grinned. Then let's test it, he announced, and before Izuku knew what was happening, Tomura had pulled a flick knife from a pocket. Green eyes widened at the sight of it. Where did you get that? Izuku demanded. Traveling with weapons was prohibited on public transport. Never mind that, Tomura growled. It's to check that the quirk works, he admonished. Izuku didn't wince, but he wasn't looking forward to that bit. He held out his hand. Tomura put the knife against his forefinger and cut. Blood welled up immediately and Izuku hissed at the pain. But then it stopped. Izuku pushed his thumb forward and wiped the blood away. It smeared, but they could both see that the cut was gone. Izuku raised his finger to his mouth and sucked the remaining blood before he displayed the finger again. The wound really was gone, and while it was unlikely that a cut that size would leave a scar, there was nothing. He grinned. Tomura gave a small smile. The teen looked odd without the hands gripping his body, but the smile was happy. Now a bigger test, he announced. Before Izuku could object, Tomura stabbed the knife forward. The teen was too close to dodge, and Izuku felt the blade stab through, into his shoulder. He raised his hand to defend, but Tomura pulled the knife back and that motion slashed the flesh there. Blood splattered on the pavement, and Izuku drew breath to cry. Tomura slammed his gloved hand over his mouth, muffling his cry. Green eyes went wide with pain, but as Izuku struggled to breath around Tomura's hand, the wounds healed. Izuku shook his head when the sting vanished and then pushed at Tomura's arm. He felt a bit woozy, but as he looked at the skin on his hand, it was whole again. Tomura prodded his shoulder with his gloved fingers. His clothes were sticky with blood around the hole in them, but his skin was whole again. It works. Tomura had a real smile this time. I don't feel so good, Izuku said. He felt weak, tired and hungry all at the same time. Tomura reacted quickly, grasping his shoulders and pushing him so that he was leaning against the fence. I had to test it, he said, unapologetic. Izuku gulped, and nodded. He closed his eyes. I'm tired. We'll get you something to eat from the vending machine near the bus stop, the teen said. But I have to go tell Jiko Chiyu that you are borrowing her quirk, Tomura added. Izuku nodded before he tilted his head back, resting it on the fence. Okay, he whispered. Tomura looked at him carefully, judging something before he turned away, tugging at his gloves. He let himself in via the gate and went to the door. Izuku heard him knock before he heard the door open. The green-haired boy turned slightly, seeing that Tomura had let himself in. The door handle was gone. He'd object later to that, but he knew they had to make good time. Izuku was tired, but he knew that Kurogiri would be worried. So would Gigantomachia. They had to head back now. And then, after Izuku gave the quirk to his dad, and dad was healed, then he could give the quirk back to Jiko Chiyu and everything would go back to the way it was. Probably. If the bad guys had found his dad, then there were probably going to be changes. But at least dad would be better. Izuku clung to that thought as he tried to keep his eyes open. The house was quiet until there was a cry and a thump. Izuku pushed himself upwards. Tomura had probably surprised Jiko Chiyu. He wasn't entirely sure what he could do, but he opened the gate and walked up the steps to the door. Just as it slid open, Tomura appeared again. We are good to go, the teen said. She's okay with it? Izuku asked. Of course. Tomura replied. It's for sensei. He dismissed the matter with the words. Of course, Izuku agreed. It's for dad, he confirmed. I'm tired, he added. I'll get you food when we get to the bus stop, the white-haired teen said, but Izuku felt the way Tomura gripped his arm. He could feel that one finger was deliberately raised, so as not to dust his shirt. He was pulled along for a few meters before the teen stopped. Do you have another jacket or something? Tomura asked, digging carefully into a pocket to pull out a glove. Izuku blinked, thinking. In my backpack, he said. The teen turned him around and Izuku heard his backpack unzip. Then the jumper was dumped on his head. Put that on, came the instruction. We'll get odd looks if you are covered in blood, was the explanation. Izuku complied and he actually felt better with the extra layer on. Come on, we need to get back, the teen said, taking Izuku's hand. He nodded. They had to get back, because now, they could actually help. That thought chased away the tiredness, and Izuku felt good. End chapters 46 and 47, The Emperor's Dragon, Nestling. Thank you for listening. Join me again to listen to the next chapters.